Hello and welcome. We are so happy to have you here with us as we take our fourth and final class of Rabbi Dr. David Harbater's From Creation to the Flood, the Dual Foundations of Judaism. You have been leading us on an incredible journey thus far. We're all very anxious to hear how the conclusion of this journey reaches its climax. Without any further ado, Rabbi Harbater, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Fishman. Gerald, it'd be nice to see your face. Florence, it's nice to see yours. And I don't know if you recall the question I posed at the very, very end of last week's class. Someone else is joining us. I'm going to admit him. At the end of last week's class, oh, Gerald, it's nice to see your face. So at the end of last week's class, I put, well, let me just back up a little bit. We're talking about the flood, and I argued, and I continue to argue, that there are two stories of the flood, and we're trying to flesh out the difference between these stories. And actually, the word "flesh" is important to our conversation. You'll see in a moment. We saw that in the J account of the flood, the last thing we said in the J account of the flood, we have the animals who are perishing along with the human being. And the question is, why? What did the animals do to deserve this kind of fate? After all, it's the human beings who sinned. So why punish the animals as well? And if you recall, I answered the question, the answer to that question, according to Jay, well, it requires us to backtrack into the first chapters of Genesis. See, if you recall, just a few lessons ago, we explained that there are two creation stories, and the two flood stories echo the worldviews of the two creation stories. So in one of the creation stories, the J creation story, the animals were created as to alleviate man's sense of loneliness. God recognized the human being was lonely. And so before he created the woman, if you recall, he created animals as if the animals were going to alleviate his loneliness. Of course, after the animals were created, the human being realized this is not what I'm looking for. And then God, in fact, created the woman. But the point being is that from Jay's perspective, the purpose of the existence of animals in this world is for the sake of man. If not for man's loneliness, animals would never have been created in Jay's world. Which means, let's skip forward to the flood story. If we're wondering why the animals had to perish along with the human being, well, the answer should be obvious. Because if the animals were created for the sake of the human being, once human beings are destined to die in the flood because of their sin, then there's no point in keeping animals alive in the world. And so their fate is sealed once the human being's fate is sealed. The only reason that God allowed animals to survive is so that when Noah and his family emerge from the ark, they will be able to rebuild the world with a minimal number of animals, 2 for just general function, and 7 for sacrificial worship, which he actually engages in immediately after the flood. So that all made sense, and we discussed that at the end of our class last week. But the question I posed to you is, according to P's account of creation, and just to remind you, in P's account of creation, the animals were not created for the sake of the man, the human being. The animals were created to reproduce, to multiply, to fill the earth. Peru urvu. They had their own distinct function, and it's not necessarily because they were created for the sake of man. And so the question then becomes, well, if the human beings sinned, then why punish the animals along with the human? They have their own function in the world. Then why, if the human beings, if there was corruption among human beings, then why punish the animals as well? And that was sort of the cliffhanger I left you with to ponder over the course of the week. So I was just wondering if any of you had any thoughts on the subject between last week and this week. If you come up with an answer to this question, I'd love to hear it before I propose my own. So this is your opportunity to speak up. Any thoughts? Okay, so I take it from the silence that you didn't come up with anything, but I do hope that you have a book of Genesis in front of you. It could be English. English Hebrew is better, but if you only have the English, but without the book, it's going to be very difficult for you to follow this class. So I'm going to pause for a moment and wait for everyone, the few of you who are here, to please pull out a text of the book of Genesis, and I'll ask you to open up to chapter 6 of Genesis, verses 12 and 13. This is actually the background to the story. I don't know, Joe, are you with us? I can't see your face. But if you are with us, we'd love to see you and have access to a text. So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 6, verse 12 and 13. Now, this is the background, and I want to read it carefully to you because this often goes unnoticed when you read the text. So let's read verse 11, actually. Start from verse 11. Okay? It says, and I'm going to read the English just because of our time restrictions, chapter 6, verse 11. And again, this is the JPS translation, which might be slightly different from the translation that you have in front of you. The earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness. When God saw how corrupt the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on earth. Okay. Now, let me ask you the following question. Based on what we just read, and if you paid attention to certain words that repeat themselves, what became corrupt? Or what was corrupt? I'm going to read it again. The earth became corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness when God had saw how corrupt the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on earth. Hi, Sandra. So what, you heard the words that I emphasize. What's the word that keeps repeating itself? The key word.
Flesh, flesh.
Well, no, flesh only appears once. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The other word is the word is earth. The earth became corrupt. The earth was filled with lawlessness.
Earth, right.
The earth was, right, how corrupt the earth became corrupt. Now, notice that we typically assume that the corruption was caused by humanity. That might be true. But nevertheless, the text uses the word the earth became corrupt. Now, and that's important because it requires some analysis. And then the text ends, the verse ends with, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on earth. Now, the question being, what does all flesh mean? What does it refer to? Okay, by the way, the term appears again in verse 17, chapter 6, verse 17. Just let's skip to verse 17, a few verses later. For my part, I'm about to bring the flood, waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh under the sky in which there is breath of life. Everything on earth shall perish. So let me ask you, what is flesh? All flesh under the sky. What is God going to destroy?
Humans.
What? What's flesh? What is the flesh that God refers to? All right, if you
humans, no?
No, see, let me show you even more clearly. Like, take a look at verse 19. Go 2 verses later. Okay? It says, 2 verses later, it says, 1 second. When it says that God is to destroy all flesh under the sky, okay, forget 2 verses. How about the following? Chapter 7, verse 15. Chapter 7, verse 15. And I'll read it in English. What does it say? They came to Noah into the ark, 2 each of all flesh in which there was breath of life. So what came into the ark? What is all flesh referred to? Help me out here, guys. Come on. By now it's obvious.
Anything that's alive.
Anything that's alive. In other words, right? The Torah uses the term, or in Hebrew, basal, flesh, because the Torah considers, right, it's the flesh that's going to be destroyed, and it's the flesh that's going to, 2 of each kind is going to survive. Now, if that's the case, if the word flesh, and it does appear throughout, referring to all living creatures, which means humans and animals, so if you go back chapter 6, verse 12, the background to the flood. In other words, if basal, flesh, are those who are going to perish, means all flesh. So when it says in verse 12 of chapter 6, it says, when God saw how corrupt the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its ways on earth. What does that mean?
Including the animals corrupted.
Thank you. So who is the guilty party? According to the text,
Everything.
well, every living
Thing.
being is guilty. This is critical.
How is
Because
that possible?
1 second. Good question, Sandra. We would love to see your face, by the way.
Oh, I don't know if I got. Let me see.
Okay.
How do I do this?
Well, if you, whatever it is, we'll do with what you do. If you could show your face, that would be great. But Sandra's on target here. Listen carefully.
I turned it
now
on
we see your
video, but it's not working.
No,
Yeah,
we see half your
you're
face. We see the
You're
upper.
on.
Now we see. Guys,
see-
listen carefully to what Sandra just said. What the text is telling us is shocking.
I put video.
It's telling us that the reason that animals perished along with human beings, unlike the J account, which has human animals perishing because they are sort of extensions of the human being. And if the human being doesn't exist, there's no point in having animals because their entire existence is a function of the human. P has a completely different worldview. P has to answer the question of why the animals perish, but P has a completely different answer. P is saying the reason the animals perish is because they sinned too. When the text tells us that all flesh had corrupted its way and worth, it means that the entire earth was corrupt, all living things. And so therefore the impact was across the globe. That's why it refers to earth, because it wasn't just humans. Is that corruption extended to the animal world as well? Now you're going to ask the obvious question. Humanists that we are, we also typically assume that how could you blame animals for corruption? Isn't corruption something that is limited to human beings who have the capacity to decide between right and wrong, have a moral sense, to be able to distinguish between good and bad and right and wrong? And so in what sense can animals be held accountable for corruption? In our typical modern worldview, that sounds very bizarre. But the text is clearly assigning blame to the animals. Now, the question is, what are they guilty of? And so the theory is, and I think it's actually quite reinforced by the text, as I will show you. Apparently, and there's no evidence, there's circumstantial evidence to support this theory, which is the following. Apparently, before the flood, animals were meant to be herbivores. And that's the way they were meant to be. In fact, the text says clearly in the story of creation, it says, if I don't have time, but if you can look back at the end of chapter 1 of Genesis, in the P account of Genesis, it says, God says very clearly, and to all the animals, this is, if you want to take a look at chapter 1, verse 30, and to all the animals in the land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is the breath of life, I gave all the green plants for food. Both human beings and animals were meant to be herbivores. I think I mentioned humans were not allowed to eat meat prior to the flood, but neither were animals allowed to eat meat. Well, it could very well be that animals violated, their natural order and started to become carnivores. And that was a violation of the natural order, which, by the way, corresponds with what most likely is the greatest sin committed by human beings, The text uses the word corruption. In Hebrew, the word is batishachet, or lawlessness, Hamas.
Shchita.
I'm sorry?
Shchita.
No, but that's with a tet. Shchita. That's a very thoughtful suggestion. Just it doesn't work because in Hebrew, shchita is with a tet.
I didn't know what word.
It's fine. It's fine. It means corruption. Here's translated corruption. There are other similar translations, but it doesn't spell out what sin they committed. And as I'm going to try to show you soon, I believe that the sin that human beings were committed. Well, you can think about it. What was the one command in P's worldview that human beings were assigned? What was the one command that God gave human beings when he created the world? Remember in the P account, Genesis chapter 1, try to recall from earlier classes. What is the number one? What's the most important thing that God, the number one thing with which God is concerned when he created a human being? What was his task in the world? I shouldn't say his, their task, male and female. What was their task? First and foremost was to? Excellent. That's right. It was to procreate. It was pu-uvel, to create more human beings. Pu-uvel. And so since that was the only command, it makes sense that what could be the greatest sin, what would be, if there's only one command, and now we're saying that the world was filled with corruption, what's the nature of this corruption? You'd have to reasonably assume it's a violation of the very one commandment that God gave them. If God said, procreate, create more life, then we have to assume that the greatest sin is undermining that very command, taking away life.
Yeah.
In other words, the text, while it doesn't spell out the nature of the corruption, from the context, it appears that the corruption is murder. Human beings were committing murder. And we're going to see in a moment how that's clear from the aftermath of the flood in a moment. So what I'm suggesting is that both human beings and animals were guilty. They were supposed to be herbivores in their diet, and they ended up, human beings, killing other human beings for whatever purpose, and perhaps even animals, and animals, right, involved in eating other animals, and that wasn't part of the original divine plan. So the answer to the question that I posed, according to P, why were the animals punished? The answer is because the animals also sinned. Okay? So if you were in suspense, here is the answer. Animals were punished because the animals sinned along with human beings. And now the earth is filled with corruption. And the emphasis on the earth. Now, that explains another thing. Our analysis now explains another thing. Because if you recall from our last class, remember I said to you that the difference, or one of the differences between the J account and the P account, has to do with the source of the water. If anybody recalls from last week, what is the source of the water according to J, right? Everybody agrees it was a flood. However, there's two versions of the source of the water. So anybody can remind me, in J's version of the flood story, what was the source of the water? Okay, I'll tell you. Always giving you a chance to respond and evoke some mammoth scratch your head and try to remember things, but a lot happens in a week, so it's okay. I forgive you. It's fine. There's no grades in this class. So just to refresh your memory, we said last week that one version of the flood, the J version of the flood, says the flood was caused by rainfall, rain from the heaven, rain like anything else for 40 days. The other version of the flood said, no, we said there's rain from above, but there's also the waters from below. The waters from below. And if you recall what we said, if you want, we could just take a look at this. I kind of don't want to read it again because we did read it last week. But we said that the description of the flood in the P account is more dramatic. It's more dramatic because it isn't just rain. It's what? If you recall, give you a few seconds to recall. And if you don't, then I'll tell you what we said last week. All right, here we go. So it wasn't just rainfall. It was the undoing of creation. Because the language they use, remember in the creation story, God separated the waters from above, from the waters below. But suddenly, in the wake of the corruption of the earth, or all inhabitants of the earth, God removed that separation. And now it all comes crashing down. That separation is no longer. So now the water from above and the water from below are now once again, right, entering the sphere, the realm of the earth. And that's what caused the flood. Now, based on what we said, why would there have to be such a dramatic, right, description of the flood according to P? Why is it only in P's worldview that it was necessary literally to undo creation based on what we said. Help me out here. Okay, then I'll say it. Because since in P's worldview, it wasn't just humanity that was guilty. All of the living beings on earth were guilty. They were all responsible for the corruption, which is why the text tells us the earth became corrupt. The earth was filled with lawlessness. How corrupt the earth was. The entire earth was corrupt because all living species, all living beings were causing this corruption. Hence, the destruction caused by the flood has to be more than just rainwater. It ends up being water. It ends up being an undoing of creation, which is what the flood really is. And therefore, because in P's worldview, every living being was guilty, therefore, the entire world, the entire fabric of the universe has to be destroyed. And that's the language that the text employs when it talks about the flood story in P's version. So are we with me? Because we're going to move on. So we have two descriptions of the guilty parties, and therefore, as a result of the difference between J and P and who was guilty, who was the cause of the source of the problem, therefore, the nature of the flood, right, is different in both accounts. All right. But now I want to talk about the world after the flood, and we'll see all of this and how it flows into the story that follows the flood. So let's take a look at the story that follows the flood in chapter 9. So I'd like you to all open up chapter 9 because we're going to read a few verses at the very beginning of chapter 9. And when I start reading this, I'd like anyone who was here on lesson number 1, I don't know if any of you were, but if you were or listened to the lesson, that some of this should sound familiar. So we're going to read, this is the aftermath of the flood in the P account. Let's read. And I'm going to read the English just because of our time limitations. God blessed Noah, chapter 9, verse 1. Okay? God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fertile and increase and fill the earth. That sounded all familiar? What does that remind you of? What does that remind you of, that verse?
Way back in the beginning of the creation.
Exactly.
I wasn't with you. I'm sorry.
You weren't with me, but Sandra, obviously familiar with the text. Chapter 9 evokes chapter 1 because here we are. The flood is over. I didn't read the verses because it's a very long description. We didn't have time. We don't have time. But virtually what happens at the end of the flood is that those barriers that were erased, the barriers between the waters above and waters below that were erased, which caused the undoing of creation, were restored. So now the waters above and below are back in their place because the flood is over. But now that the flood is over, remember what we said about the flood. The flood was the undoing of creation. So now that the flood is over and we're going to start again, what do we have to do again?
Put back those barriers.
Put those barriers. That already happened a few in the previous chapter. And now we have to recreate the world. We have to recreate the world, which is why
from scratch.
I'm sorry?
From scratch, then.
Yes.
You have to recreate from scratch.
So, exactly. So now we're repeating, right, the verse that appears almost verbatim, the verse that appears at the very beginning of creation, because this is a new creation, right? If the flood represented the undoing of creation, or the destruction of the world, then the period after the flood is a new period in the history of the world. And so it begins virtually with the same verse that we hear in chapter 1. But it's not quite the same. Let's read carefully. It sounds very much alike, but it's not exactly alike, as we'll read. I'm sorry, I'll read the English. Chapter 9, verse 2. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon the beasts of the earth and upon all the birds of the sky, everything with which the earth is astir, and upon all the fish of the sea, they are given into your hand. Now, I don't have time to show you, but there's a slight variation here. Because if you read back in chapter 1, the relationship between the man and the animals, if you want, I'll read it to you. If you want, you can look very, very briefly. What did God say to human beings when he created them in chapter 1? He said, yes, be fertile and increase, but it says, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. Rule them, right? It's an active thing. You have to actively rule them, exercise control over the animals. The language here is slightly different. It doesn't say that you have to actively do it.
But
What does
how
it
could
say?
he rule them? Man wasn't even created yet.
When? Are you
In
talking
the
about
very
chapter 1?
beginning, the order of creation, in terms of, I don't know what verse you're referring to, but the order of creation,
Are you
man
talking
was
chapter 1
created
or
at the
chapter 9? Chapter
chapter
1?
one.
No, chapter
Yeah,
1, of course, the animals were created.
animals were, but man wasn't created to rule them.
No. In chapter 1, they were. When man was created, he was told to rule them, to fill the earth and rule the animals, okay? But in chapter 9, when God recreates the world, he uses a slightly different language. He doesn't say you have to actively. He says, the fear and dread of you shall be upon the beasts of the earth. And in other words, you don't have to actively rule. They will instinctively be afraid of you. They will instinctively have this dread of human beings. Now, what this is doing, if you understand the difference, one is that human beings have to exercise their control over animals in chapter 1, but in chapter 9, the Torah is shifting its focus. It's saying that now in this new creation, animals will instinctively feel the dread of human beings. You won't have to exercise your control because they will instinctively know that you're in control. Now, they are given into your. What God is doing is creating a distance between human beings and animals. Remember that animals were created along with human beings on the 6th day, or at least land animals were created along with human beings on the 6th day. But let's say another important thing. Okay, just recall the context. We agreed that according to Pete, animals were guilty along with human beings. Yes? No? Maybe so? According to what we said,
Yes.
animals sinned as well. There's only one thing. Was there any good animal that stood out? Or was there a righteous animal that stood out and deserved to be saved? Not that I know of. But we do have a righteous human being named Noah who deserved to be saved. So if they were all guilty and they all sinned, but only human beings had a representative who was righteous, who was worthy of being saved, which means that now the animals have no redeeming quality, so to speak, because they're all guilty. But there was one human being that stood out from all other human beings. While all living beings were guilty, there was one human being who was righteous, which means that now human beings have an elevated status compared to animals. If in the P version of creation, animals and human beings were on the same day, even though animals were not created in the image of God, they sinned. They were both responsible for the corruption on earth, but only humanity produced a Noah, a righteous man. And so now, in the new creation after the flood, God now creates or widens the gap between human beings and animals. And one of the ways he widens that is saying you won't have to impose your will on animals. They will instinctively have a certain dread of you. Now, we're going to see how that's even more pronounced in the verses ahead. In other words, that animals and human beings they both were involved in this sin. They were both created in a sense on the 6th day, but now human beings are going to assume a more important role in the world than even before in relation to animals. So here, let's read on. Okay, verse number 3. Number 3 of chapter 9. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. As with the green grasses, I give you all these. What is the great chidush? What is the great new innovation, the new change in the moral structure of the world now? What does God permit now for the first time that he did not permit beforehand?
If man rules over animals, then he can take their life.
Which means, of course, le'ochla, he says anyway, it's yours to eat. You want to understand the dramatic change that occurred in the aftermath of the flood. The most significant change is that before the flood, humans were meant to be vegetarian. Humans and animals were meant to be vegetarian. But now, because the gap between human beings and animals has now widened, God now permits animals for consumption. This is a dramatic turn of events. That now, after the flood, humanity is allowed to eat animals. But at the same time, the Torah spells out, right? I'm allowing you this, but let's read verse 4. You must not, however, eat flesh with its life blood in it. In other words, if you're eating an animal, you're not allowed to eat the animal with its blood. That's vicious. You know that you have to drain it from its blood. So the Torah it seems to be saying, I'm going to give you animals, but let's do it in a way that's not vicious and brutal at eating their blood too. And then the Torah goes on in verse 5. But for your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. I will require it of every beast, of man too. Will I require a reckoning for human life, of every man for that of his fellow man. And then it goes on, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in his image did God make man. See, this, I think, reinforces the point. What was the primary sin? What was the primary source of corruption in our reading, in my reading? I said and I argued that it's murder. And how do you prevent murder in the future? Well, you come out and say it, right? In the past, when God created the world, he just said, right, create life, right? Pruervu, which is to procreate, create more life. But he never prohibited murder. It's implied, right? It's implied. If you're supposed to create life, then you're not supposed to take away life. Well, apparently they didn't get that message. And that's the problem with the generation of Noah, that they apparently, right, took other people's life, committed murder, rampant murder. And that's why God had to bring about the flood. So now that he's recreating the world, he has to spell out the prohibition very clearly. Guys, now let me tell you, in the new world, okay, you are absolutely, positively not allowed to murder. Okay, and you are going to be punished severely if you do. In fact, it'll be a death penalty. Okay, but what's fascinating is at the same time that he prohibits murder of other human beings, he's allowing murder or the slaughter of animals, which again has two explanations. One is, well, animals didn't produce a righteous animal like Noah, humanity produced a righteous human being. And the other reason is, and this is psychology. This is psychology. And by the way, every one of us who's ever had children knows about this. If you're going to prohibit one thing and you're going to try to be very strict, it's always a good idea with your children is if I'm going to prohibit this, find something else that is now permitted. If I want to accept additional prohibitions on my life, saying, okay, you can't do this, but you can do this. In other words, God, at a certain level, recognized the human weakness, the fallacy, the flaws of human condition who unfortunately were involved in murder. And so the world after the flood, he has to spell out the prohibition clearly and the consequences. But at the same time, he says, okay, apparently, because you guys, right, didn't have the capacity or didn't have the wherewithal to avoid the most horrible crime, murder, I'm going to prohibit murder clearly, but at the same time, I'm going to, let's call that urge, that violent urge that some of us have, I'm going to allow you, give it expression, right, in terms of animals, right? I want to inhibit the urge for violence toward other human beings. And how do I do that? I allow you to give expression to that urge because now I'm permitting you to kill animals for the sake of consumption. And it was an awareness of sort of the human limitations and so what God does is create a new kind of world, which on the one hand prohibits murder on the pain of death, but at the same time, it says, okay, I know that we all have this urge for violence, so I'm going to allow you to give it expression by killing animals for consumption. And by the way, it's interesting.
Lost it.
Yeah.
It looks like we may have lost
I lost it.
David. I can share with you as I'm living around the corner from him that we just experienced the power cut. Probably noticed his screen and my screen all went dark. That's because the lights in our home suddenly turned off.
He has to reboot his computer then.
Yeah, he's going to have to reboot his computer. You might be wondering why I'm still here. And the answer to that is that I have a special external battery on my computer and Wi-Fi system.
Are we
Okay,
ready to resume?
we're back.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you so much. I apologize for that. Unfortunately, we live in a town that slightest thing could set off the electricity. An hour and a half ago, there was a short and power outage, and we're going to disrupt the class. We started the class beautifully, and then lo and behold. All right, let's continue. All right, if I recall, here we go. God is recreating the world after the flood, and after the flood, he is prohibiting, on pain of death, murder, but permitting animals. And the interesting thing is, if you look in verse 5 of chapter 9, it says, but for your own life blood I will require it of every beast. For every beast of man too. What do you mean I require it of every beast? What the text is saying is if an animal kills a human being, he will be punished as well. Now, why is that consistent? As strange as it may sound, the same way that animals were held accountable for the corruption in the world prior to the flood, well, after the flood, they are not allowed to kill human beings. It's very strange. We can't imagine why animals would be held accountable, but apparently in P's worldview, they are. If an animal kills a human being, that animal is meant to be put to death. Even though, hypothetically, we could say, what was the animal conscious of doing something morally reprehensible? That is what P is telling. But let me just review the point, because in a moment we're going to shift our attention to J. So P is, God understands that human beings, if God were to create the world, although he's recreating the world after the flood, God is making certain changes in the nature of the world. Certain rules that were either implicit, not explicit, are made explicit, and certain changes, a very fundamental change was introduced into the world after the flood, namely that human beings are now allowed to eat animals for the very first time. And on this assumption, right, God then, right, this is the background, and the next thing that happens is verse 8, God then has this covenant, which I don't have time to discuss now. We have a very limited amount of time, that God establishes a covenant with human beings. And as we mentioned last week, what is the sign of the covenant? That he will not bring another flood. And of course, that the sign of the covenant is the rainbow. And that is more or less the way the story ends in chapter 9. Which is, right, God has a blueprint for the world after the flood. He recognizes what caused the downfall of human beings or the living beings of the world. And God creates a new world order. The world after the flood is a new creation, a new world order with certain changes in the rules and expectations. And at the same time, God then promises, right, in a sense, you do what I do, and I will make sure that there'll never be a flood again. And he shows the sign of the rainbow. And that seems to be, right, the direction, the world, it's laying the groundwork for the world in the future. Now I'd like to go back and go review the aftermath of the flood in J's worldview and see how it's different from P's worldview. So we actually mentioned this last time, but let's go back to chapter 8, right? Remember we said that J and P have different understandings of the causes of the flood, the nature of the flood, the details of the flood differ from J and P, but even the aftermath of the flood is different in J and P. So we already discussed P's presentation of the recreation of the world, but J also has a description of what happens right after the flood, and it appears at the end of chapter 8, which we read briefly last week, but I'm going to read it a little bit again with you. So if you look at chapter 8, verse 20, what happens after the flood? Verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking of every clean animal and of every clean offered burnt offerings on the altar. So Noah on his own decided to bring an offering to God. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So now Noah brought
a sacrifice, an offering, an animal offering from the clean animals that he brought on the and God smells this, and he makes a grand declaration about the future of the world. Never again will I doom the earth because of man, etc., etc., and never again destroy every living being as I have done, etc. Now, let's try to analyze this for a moment. God smelled the nice smell of the birds, the offering of the animals. Okay, this is a pretty dramatic reaction to this really nice smell. I smell it, I think, and now as a result of smelling the nice smell of the odor, the fragrance of the animals, the pleasing odor, he makes a declaration about the future of the world. Never do this, never destroy. That's very dramatic. That's very dramatic for one little act, one little sacrificial act that Noah performs to elicit that kind of reaction from God is, I think you would agree with me, is pretty impressive. So how do you explain that one act? Now, it's true, Noah was a righteous person, even in Jay's worldview. But still, this one ritual that Noah performs elicits such a dramatic reaction from God, that requires some explanation. It seems that it's a bit, far-fetched. I would say it's extreme, right? Wouldn't it be nice that the smallest ritual that we do, whether it's prayer or an act of kindness, the smallest thing that we do would elicit this kind of incredible. I would love for me to be able to offer a little sacrifice to God now, and he will promise to destroy Hamas tomorrow and never have to face Hamas again. I would love that if one little ritual act would elicit from God a promise of this nature. So you understand, it's a pretty extreme reaction on the part of God, even if we're dealing with the great righteous Noah. So it seems to me the explanation for this has to do with one key verse that appears in verse 21. At the end of verse 21, there's something there that should be surprising to everyone. It says the following. I'm going to read the verse again and highlight the key words. Never again will I doom the earth because of man, since the devisings of man's mind are evil from his youth. I want to understand those words. Since the devising of man's mind are evil from his youth. That's why God will never doom the earth because of man. That's a very strange thing. Because man is inherently evil, listen to the logic of this. What God is saying, man is basically bad. Human beings are basically bad or evil, and that's why I'm not going to inflict this kind of pain on him again. Now, the logic seems to be the other way around. If God would say human beings are basically good, so I won't inflict it again. But God is not saying. He's saying that human beings are basically evil, and therefore I won't inflict this kind of pain again. But it's particularly strange because if you look right before the flood, in Jay's version of the flood, it almost used the same words. If you go back to chapter 6, verse 5, and keep your finger on chapter 6, verse 5, and compare it to chapter 8, verse 21, it's almost the same words. What does God say in chapter 6, verse 5? He says, the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness. Again, chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how every plan devised by him was nothing but evil all the time. God saw how evil he was, and what happened as a result in chapter 6 when God saw how evil he was, that led to the decision to do what? Help me out here. In chapter 6, when God recognized how evil human beings are, what did he decide to do? He decided to bring about a flood. In chapter 6, when God recognizes how great was man's wickedness and how every plan devised by him was nothing but evil all the time, that's what led to the decision to bring about a flood. Now, almost the same words after the flood, God says, almost the same words. He says, since the devisings of man's mind were evil from his youth, this is what he says in chapter 8, verse 21. Therefore, I will never, ever never destroy every living being as I have done. Now, what's going on here? This seems like ridiculous. Before the flood, God said, because human beings are evil, I'm bringing about the flood. But now, after the flood, God is saying, because human beings are evil, I will never, ever bring about this kind of devastation again. What's going on? Recognition of human frailty and weakness and fallibility and evil and tendency towards evil led to the decision to bring about the flood. Now suddenly that same recognition is leading God to never bring a flood. And the only explanation to this, are you ready for the key line here? I hope you're sitting on the edge of your seats, guys. The only explanation for the difference is that God changed his mind. Let me explain to you. God, as a result of the flood, had a change of heart. Remember, in Jay's world, God is a very human-like God. He's got heart, he's got feelings, he's got regret, he's got sadness. Well, let me tell you what God has a change of heart. And I want to compare it to parenting. Parents can very often have a plan for their children about how they want to raise them. And I'm going to be very harsh and very strict at the beginning. And I think that's the way to bring about my difficult children, to bring about the results that I want. And that very often is the strategy of us as parents when we're dealing with difficult children. We punish, we're strict, and we impose great penalties for violations. That's the way we raise our children. And sometimes it doesn't help. Sometimes it's just not going to help. If I'm going to keep punishing and forcing our children to face the consequences for their actions, and it's constant battle, then they're never going to come around. Then the relationship is going to be permanently damaged. So what does God say after the flood? He says the same thing he said before the flood. The difference is that before the flood, when he saw that human beings were evil, he decided to wipe them out. After the flood, when he saw the devastation, when he saw that the entire world all of humanity was destroyed, with the exception of Noah, with Noah, he said, listen, I'm going to treat your children differently. I guess it's perhaps the difference between if you have number of children, the difference between the firstborn and the second, and sometimes the later children, the third or the fourth or the fifth child that we have, we often are softer and more forgiving. Pretty much any youngest child will affirm that, hey, my parents are older, they learned from the eldest, and now the parents are softer and more forgiving. Well, that's what God is here. He was extremely, extremely strict at the beginning, so much so that the evil, right? God felt the need to wipe out all of humanity. But it's the same awareness of human frailty and the tendency toward wickedness that led God after the flood to say, I will never bring about this kind of devastation again. So God has a change of heart. In a sense, the difference between P and J is that in P's worldview after the flood, God realizes that human beings, right? God changes the rules for human beings, so to speak, so that they can have rules that they can live by. But in J's world, he's not demanding anything of human beings. He's saying, I'm not gonna give new rules. I just have to change my approach. I'm gonna change myself. I'm gonna, rather than punish and get angry, I'm just gonna exercise self-control, and I'm gonna be a more forgiving God. God makes no demands in the J worldview. It just becomes more, he's changed his approach. He's more forgiving, understanding, more tolerant of wayward children, in this case, wayward families and his ultimate people. They become, he doesn't make any demands. But even I wouldn't give us some further. It's not just that God in the J worldview makes no demands of Noah Noah after the flood. Who does God speak to when he makes this declaration? When he makes the declaration that he will never doom the earth because of man, who does he speak to? Read the text carefully. In verse 21. Tell me who he speaks to in verse 21. When he makes this declaration. I don't hear, you're on mute. Who is he speaking to?
I asked you what chapter of 21?
Chapter 6, verse 21. I'm sorry, no. Chapter 8, verse 21. Who is God speaking to in chapter 8, verse 21? When he makes this announcement of the future of the world.
I assume man.
Sorry?
I assume man, because man's the only one who reacts and builds an altar.
No, after he builds the altar, and then God makes the declaration in verse 21. After he smells he smells the pleasing odor, and then what he makes his declaration, never again will I doom the earth because of man. All right.
Every living being.
Yeah, but who is he talking to? Who is he talking to?
Kol Chai, every living being.
No. Who's he talking to? Who's God talking to? Look at verse 21.
21.
I'll give you 5 more seconds to find the answer.
I assume man then.
Nope. Nope. I'm going to read the words in English. The Lord's, this is verse 21. It's right there in the text.
Oh, so he's saying it to himself. God is saying to himself.
Thank you. That's the answer. That's the answer. And Lord said to himself, this is a change of heart within God. God is speaking to himself like a parent saying among each husband and wife. In this case, there's only one parent saying, I have to relate to my children differently. He's not making any demands whatsoever. P's world after the flood is very explicit. God is speaking to the human being and saying, I'm recreating the world. Here are the rules to go by. They're slightly different from the rules before the flood. But he's engaging a human being in a conversation, in the relationship in which he's laying the groundwork and setting down rules. But in Jay's world, God is having an internal change. He's not sharing any of this with the human being. The promise that he makes was never heard by Noah. Are you with me? Now, we have to wrap up. So let me talk about what the implications of all this are. Let me ask, which story? Right now, we've summarized the flood story in J and P. Let's say you're Noah in P or Noah in J. Which Noah is a little more comforted and is more optimistic about the future? The Noah of P or the Noah of J, and why? Help me out here. This is an opinion question. Which Noah, right? In which case is there more optimistic and hopeful future from Noah's perspective? The Noah of P or the Noah of J?
The Noah that decides to be kind again, because maybe by being kind, the people will change their minds and not be evil either.
No, but I'm talking about from the text point of view, from the narrative's point of view, from the text point of view. If you were Noah in the J post flood in the J version of the story, and you're Noah in the P version of the story, right? Which one is more encouraging? Which one is more promising? All right. Well, I'll help you. This is an opinion question, but I think the answer should be obvious, right? In P's version of the flood, God speaks to humans. He gives him rules to follow. He gives him guidelines to follow. And not only that, he makes a promise never to bring a flood again. And remember, this is the key. Noah and his children hear the promise. They hear the promise. They know God spoke. God said, follow my rules. Here are rules. Here's a blueprint for life after the flood. And if you follow this, right, all will be well. There will never be a flood again. And they heard this stated from God. But in Jay's worldview, God never spoke to Noah. He never said to him. Noah brought an offering, and he didn't tell Noah whether he accepted the offering. He didn't give him a blueprint for creating a new world after the flood. And even the great promises that God made after the flood, he never shared with Noah. So Noah could be walking around after the flood thinking, oh my God, maybe there's another flood that's going to happen tomorrow. How do I know there's not going to be another flood? And what am I supposed to do to prevent that? God said nothing to Noah. So Noah, in Jay's account, can be walking around frustrated and worried that any moment another flood can erupt. But P, God gave him a very clear, right, plan for how to build a new world, a healthier world, a more moral world. He gave him a plan, and he gave him a promise, and he was privy to that. So therefore, in the Noah who was part of the P story is a much more optimistic and hopeful world. But in J, it's a very different Noah, a Noah who was unaware of any of the promises, who doesn't know what he's supposed to be doing with his life at this stage. And therefore, if we were to ask what events were to occur in the Torah afterward, right, which is more likely to succeed, the Noah and his children in P, or the Noah and his children in J?
Because he knows what he has to do and not do.
And God promised never to bring a flood again. So in fact, if you read the Torah afterwards, which obviously we don't have time because we're virtually out of time, is that the stories after the flood, right? The couple of stories after the flood, one in particular, the story of the Tower of Babel, which appears, the story of the Tower of Babel that appears a little bit after the flood, is a J story. And it shows the decline of humanity once again. It shows the decline of humanity, which makes sense because they were not given a very clear blueprint of how to conduct their lives. They had to figure it out on their own. But in P, the events following the flood in P actually are positive developments. The world goes ahead in its business and it's recreated. I don't have time to show you. The world, right? The chapter 10, right, is a description of the world, human beings spreading out to the world, which is what they're meant to do. And which ultimately leads to a world that's living up to God's expectations in P. But in J, the world continues its decline. And that's partly because after the flood, God didn't give Noah a very clear direction, nor did he state the promise openly, which could lead to sort of a sense of despair, a sense of discouragement, and lacking the tools, the guidelines to move forward. So even after the flood, in J's world, there is a decline, a continued decline. And the only moment that it declines, the only time it declines is when you get to Abraham. The story in J's worldview ends, right? The stories of the beginning of Genesis end with the emergence of Abraham, because Abram was the first person who was able to figure out on his own, right, how to create a better world, to create a better place, to figure out to do what was right without the very detailed description. So basically, the stories of chapters 1 through 11 in Genesis, in J's worldview, was a story of humanity's gradual decline. And because humanity's gradual decline, God felt a need at some point to choose one particular person, Abraham, with whom he can create a relationship that would sort of have the understanding of what's expected of them, because the rest of humanity failed one abysmal failure after the other. God, in J's worldview, wanted human beings to sort of figure things out on their own without God spelling it out. And most of humanity wasn't able to do that, which was what necessitated the choosing of one particular person, Abraham, and his children to be his chosen people. But P, by the time the flood was over, humanity understood its purpose. And so the decision at some point later on in biblical history, when God singled out Abraham, it wasn't because he was disappointed with the rest of mankind. It's because when God, the very thoughtful, calculated God that we described in Genesis 1, when he created humanity, he had a plan that he was going to create a world comprised of human beings, and they were going after their function in the world, right? And he would also create a special people with whom God would have a special relationship, not because the rest of humanity failed. In P's worldview, all of humanity has a divine function, but that divine function is for all of humanity. God, in the P worldview, has a separate plan for the people of Israel who emerged from Abraham. And so, in summary, because I know that I have to end, in fact, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are the background to the emergence of the people of Israel, starting with Abraham in chapter 12. In J's worldview, the entire section from chapter 1 through 11 is the story of humanity's failure. And it's because of humanity's failure that God ultimately had to choose one people, Abraham, with whom he would have create a special relationship and a special nation, because he was disappointed with all the failures of the rest of humanity. But in P's worldview, God's decision to elect Abraham and his children later on in history was not because he was fundamentally disappointed with all of humanity. It's because the calculated God the master planner, right, who created the world, also created a different circles of human life and human existence. And so when he created humanity, they had their own function. And later on, the people of Israel will have their own function. And so to sum up, the 11 chapters of Genesis, which are we only discussed a small portion of them, really serve to explain the rest of the Torah. Because the rest of the Torah is the story of God and Abraham, his children, and the people of Israel. And the question is, why do we need this first 11 chapters? Because the first 11 chapters serve to explain the background, right, to the idea of God and his special relationship with the people of Israel, which emerges from chapter 12 and onwards. Now, what I just did here is a tiny, tiny fraction of what I do in my book. If you could see it in the beginnings, discovering the two worldviews hidden within Genesis 1 through 12. I did what a teaser of a 12-chapter book and in 4 lessons, but there's much more to be said on the subject. But I tried to give you an overview of what I think the profound messages that are conveyed by the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And obviously, if you really want to learn more, I strongly urge you to buy my book. It's available on Amazon. And I thank you so much for your time, for being part of this process. And I apologize for the little power outage we had before. But if anybody has any questions or thoughts before we say goodbye, you're welcome to do so now.
Thank you.
Okay, that wasn't a question, but I'll take it. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Would you be able to do some other course in the future if Rabbi Fishman okays it?
Anytime Rabbi Fishman wants to ask me, I'll be happy. Listen, I told him this is a course for a year. I am teaching this course at a women's seminary, and I'm teaching it over the course of a year. And that's what it requires. I'm flying, and I'm only doing a fraction of what there is. I'm flying. I don't speak this way. I speak at a leisurely pace. But I am absolutely flying because he limited me to, actually, it was meant to be 5 lessons, but because the first one, it was a mess, it only ended up being 4. I'm doing the very best I can do in the very limited time frame that I have. I would be delighted to teach this in a broader framework, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the best I can do with the limited time he gave me. And I would also be delighted if they would invite me to Montreal. I would be more than happy to come. But it's been a pleasure. And for those of you who missed any of the lessons, you're welcome to listen to the recording. And again, it sounds like I'm marketing and I'm doing a little promotion. I'm sorry that I'm doing the promotion, but it's a lot more in the book. Any other questions or thoughts before I say goodbye?
It's been an interesting 4 classes. Actually, I only attended 3.
Well, you have it on recording.
And you've given us a lot to think about.
Good. That's the goal here. That's all I can do in 4 lessons is get you thinking about what I call really the foundations of Judaism. I believe that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which we just scratching the surface, really touch upon the very foundations of Judaism. God, humanity, man, woman, why were we chosen? Sin. There's so much. We didn't even get into Cain and Abel. We didn't have time for that. There's so much more here. Civilization, this Tower of Babel. There's so much more. Okay, and I love these chapters because they're so rich. They're so rich in terms of understanding humanity, in terms of understanding morals, moral society, right? Relationships, God, family. There's so much here, and it's so rich, and that's why I felt it's worthy of a book because there's so much here, and if you present it in a way that shows that parallel, right? Many people have written books of Genesis, but most people haven't captured the parallel stories going on simultaneously. And that is the unique, unique contribution of my book, is showing that there are 2 worldviews going on simultaneously. And I hope you got a taste of that and you'll continue reading, or perhaps you'll see me at some point in the future. All right.
If we do, give me a heads up, because if I need to move medical appointments so it doesn't conflict with your classes.
That's not up to me. That's up to Rabbi.
Well, if they give me a heads up, maybe I have some control.
Okay. Well, that's between you and Rabbi Fishman, and it's been a pleasure. And I hope you guys have enjoyed the rest of the day. And let's hope together and pray together for peace. for peace.
Yes.
Well, let me rephrase it. Let's hope and pray for the defeat of Hamas and then peace.
That's right, because you can't have one without the other.
You can't have peace while they're still alive and they're still acting. So let's all pray together in that spirit and hope that the next time we see each other, this will be behind us and we'll be able to enjoy life and happier times.
And the
Good
hostages.
day, good day, good evening, and be
Thank
well.
you again.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.